Hello out there, friends. It's Dr. Borgi here with another video. And I just want to say thank you to all of you who have been supporting me watching my videos. This video is going to be a little history about the special education system and just the education system in general here in the United States. So, just for some context, a free education that was required, like all kids had to go to school, didn't become a thing until like I think 1830s was sort of like the movement, but 1850s was really when states started passing laws saying that kids had to go to school and that the school was going to be free and paid for by the taxpayers' money. And so that started a trend, and eventually all of the states ended up doing that. And by 1913, they were all on board with this. Not every kid was allowed to attend free public school. Kids who had a certain IQ. So we had a cutoff. And as a psychologist, I'm going to say that 70 IQ or below is considered. There's the terms have changed for this over the years, but back then it was called feeble-minded. Later became mentally retarded. Now we call it a child with special needs, but there's a lot of different terms that have gone on in between those. And even now, we're always working to find a new, better term or concept. But these children were not allowed into public school because they were considered uneducable or not able to be educated. So there was a big expose in the early 1970s on a institution school, so a boarding school called Pinhurst. So what would happen is if a child was deemed as, not appropriate for free public education, they were sent to one of these basically government run schools. And there was this huge expose on this place called Penhurst in Pennsylvania, in which the conditions that the kids were living under were exposed. There were pictures of children who were basically neglected in cages, naked, just basically rotting. And they painted a real crazy picture with photos in the newspaper, and everyone in America saw it, and they were not happy with it. So, not only were parents of kids who had special needs very upset, but just regular people who could not believe that something like this could happen were outraged. Parents of children who were, basically considered feeble minded at this point were advocating trying to get their kids, into public school. But they hired a lawyer to shut down Penhurst and other institutions like it. But this lawyer was a little smarter and he said, you know what? We're not going to do that. We are going to sue for the right of your children to have a free public education just like everyone else. And that was the beginning of special education law, which we'll go into right now. Savvy lawyer won the case, but was signed into law in 1975 and is known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1975. This was a huge deal because prior to this law, as mentioned, these kids were not allowed to go to public school. But now, after this law was signed into effect by Gerald Ford, it gave these kids rights to a free and appropriate public education in what they call the least restrictive environment, which is we can't put kids in an environment that is too restricted for them. If they are able to function in a general education class, then they should be able to be in that class with support to be in that class. And if they can't be in that class, then they need a special class that is appropriate for them. But who is funding this? Taxpayers. And so no longer was tuition required, but now taxpayers were going to fund this. And the government had to start pouring money into it too because it became apparent that this was going to be expensive. It's also important to mention Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1975. So this was added to ensure that even kids who didn't quite meet the criteria for special education, that they would still get the accommodations or modifications that they needed to their education in order to access their education. The trend continued, and we had a law passed called the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. This act made inclusion a new buzzword. in education, and inclusion is still a big buzzword today. But not only was this about children and their education, but it also extended the rights of people with disabilities to other areas, such as the job market. What is today's climate like for special education? So, as someone who's just going into special education at this point, I'm coming from a field, psychology, in which I was a school counselor for a time. And in that role, basically what I would do is give kids assessments. Okay, so the way that special education begins for kids is either the school initiates or the parent initiates, and or the school initiates and the parent approves a assessment. That assessment is an IQ test. So just like in the olden days, they would give an IQ test, and if the kid has a certain IQ, then we're like, oh, they meet the criteria for special education because they have a low IQ. That's one of the 13 categories of IDEA. There's a lot of other categories as well, but the big ones that I see, the most common ones, are things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism, but then of course you've got like blindness, deafness. There's different kinds of disabilities, some that you might not even really be aware of or think about. However, they're out there, and there are categories within IDEA that allow for these students to receive special education services. Those services are determined by the assessment. So as a psychologist, I would say I recommend these services, and then the IEP team, which is a team of parents and maybe educators, maybe like occupational therapists if the kids need that, speech therapists if the kids need that, adaptive PE coaches if kids need that, and of course the special education teacher and an administrator, which is usually the vice principal, who is usually the one who's serving on that IEP team. Sometimes it could be the principal or another administrator. But all of these people, including the psychologist, will show up with the parent and talk about what the child actually needs to help them access their education. So there's a huge timeline that's in place, and you have to follow the timeline. So once an assessment is initiated by the parent, or the school initiates it and the parent approves it, then as a psychologist, I've got, but basically 30 or so days to give this assessment. You've got 60 days to get the assessment completed and also complete the first IEP meeting. So that means I got to work quickly. Everybody's got to work quickly. As soon as that IEP is in place, we have to put those accommodations. So accommodations are things that help students access their education. So like, for example, a slant board. This is a board that a kid would use to help them write because it's an easier angle for them. It's just at a slant. If we say a slant board is necessary in the IEP, then as soon as the IEP is signed by the parent, the very next day, we got to have that slant board ready to go. So it's a lot. And if you don't have the timeline down, or you mess up in some way and you miss the fact that the IEP has to be renewed every single year, there needs to be a new assessment within every 3 years. There's a lot of little intricate details you got to know. And if you miss something, you can get sued by that parent, and that is not good because you can lose some money for your school and, lose trust of parents and the community. So is there still discrimination against kids with special needs in schools and classrooms? Yes. Are there places where inclusion is upheld in a better way than others? Yes. Are there places where students who need assessments are not getting them? Yes, and for a variety of reasons. So parents have the right to say no to any of this at any point. And so if we have a certain student population in which the parents are like, we don't want special ed services for our kid, and we're like, but your kid really needs it, and the parent's like, no, then guess what? You, as a school, you can either take legal action against the parents and be like, yeah, we really need to get this kid services. Let's sue the parents, say we're doing it. Or just go, okay, that's cool. So hopefully you've learned something as a result of watching this video. And if you do like what you saw or heard, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and maybe leave a comment about what you think about special education, what you think about inclusion, what you think about institutionalizing kids versus the laws that protect them today. What do you think about the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990? What do you think about IDEA? I'd love to hear your ideas about IDEA. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and I will see you next time. Bye.